proper ideas of what is economy, and so in effect, since we're in the midst of a facade of economy, it's very important really to start where we are and dispel the myths of it, so that we can understand first of all what's wrong with it, then so that we can prove what is a solution of it, and finally so that we could move on to explaining exactly how to transform this system into a mathematically perfected economy, an economy which is an actual economy, an actual science. And by science, I don't mean to suggest the daunting proposition that there's so much for us to understand about actual economy. In fact, 99% of what we have to understand today is merely what makes the present lie of economy terminal and destructive to justice. So my introduction to economics was actually quite inadvertent. It began as a advanced student in mathematics who's required to take an economics course far below my usual curricular level, and I developed a method of learning when I was very young, where I was taking college algebra textbooks and digesting, one every couple of months or so. But my original attacks at self-taught algebra, my initial evening was futile, and the next day I just more or less naturally browsed ahead through the book and went through the end of it. And I could see the pieces and the way that they were assembled. I didn't understand much, if anything, perfectly, but seeing the pieces and how they were assembled, what we started with and where we were going with it, made it much easier to digest the material. So I sort of sped through the whole book, and then I backed up to the beginning, and I went from the beginning to halfway into it, and then through the first quarter and several chapters. And before you know it, my second evening's attempts make the first lesson, which was impossible the evening before, a piece of cake. So this was a method of learning that I adopted ever afterward, and here I am in high school now, many years later, and I'm asked to take this economics course, and of course I receive a very thick textbook equivalent of any college algebra textbook or trigonometry or whatever, and I immediately opened it and thumbed through from the beginning to the end, and I was absolutely astonished, first of all, to find that it was totally bereft of formal proof or theorem. All it amounted to was a story that you were to accept on someone's say-so, and in many, many, many cases, I could see that the propositions were either dubious or even readily refuted. And so it happened, I'm 16 in this course. I bite my lip for 2 weeks, and finally one day the teacher gives the introductory definitions of inflation and deflation, respectively, as increases or decreases in circulation per goods and services. I prefer to say per represented property, because it's a principle that we're after in monetizing production. But he immediately launches then into the familiar assertion that an increase in circulation, or inflation as we call it, causes price inflation. So to this day, they have applied this single term inflation to a process of circulatory inflation, which ostensibly precipitates in price inflation. And I just couldn't buy into this. I'm, a caliber of student who can prove the Pythagorean theorem off the top of my head the moment I hear it. So I had a reputation among the teachers, if I spoke about mathematics, you best back off in the corner and listen. And as soon as my teacher said that circulatory inflation caused price inflation, my hand shot into the air, as all our hands should always have shot into the air, about this preposterous pseudoscience of economics. And this is how this idea of mathematically perfected economy began. I raised my hand and I was recognized, and I said, "I'm sorry, Mr. Otto, but I just can't believe that could possibly be true." And began to turn a little red in the face. And I said, "First of all, you tell us that all money comes into circulation as a debt subject to interest. In other words, as a promissory obligation, and that the debts are collateralized." And he nodded his head affirmatively. And I said, "Well, therefore, how is it even possible to suffer circulatory inflation?" In other words, this was a rhetorical question which said, well, if debts are collateralized, how do you issue more money than the debt? It's impossible, you see. So he stood there, turning redder and redder and redder in the face, and finally, after considerable deliberation, he finally muttered, "By God, I think you're right." I said, "Furthermore, even if we could suffer this purported circulatory inflation, which seemingly is mathematically impossible even to exist, let's say even if we did, as the debts come into circulation subject to interest, therefore an implicit obligation would exist to reflate the circulation of all the interest and principal we're paying out of a circulation, which at most, at any time, consists of only some remaining principal." And he nods his head affirmatively. I said, "Well, whatever interest we're paying, or principal we're paying out of circulation then, being as that has to be reborrowed as new debt equal to the old, therefore would make it mathematically impossible to pay down the sum of debt." And he's looking at me as if, he's receiving a divine revelation. And
Mike, excuse, we got a break for a short break, and just hold that thought, and we'll be right back, folks.
For the purpose of this rebroadcast, I'm interrupting the retransmission of the program here to note that I've deleted the commercial, of course, but as I sat there waiting, I turned to my monitor and saw that the chat room was alive with discussion. One fellow had posted that, "Holy cow," he said something like, "I sure hope this guy doesn't, lose his train of thought there. This is the only guy I've ever heard who sounds like he knows what he's talking about." So anyway, it's unfortunate that we break for commercials in the middle of an explanation of something which is very difficult both to communicate and to assimilate by the audience. So I've deleted the commercial, and we'll just pick up again where we had left off, hopefully.
Okay, welcome back, everybody. This is Jim Conda Jr. co-hosting with Al Jordan. Our guest is Mike Montagne of the mathematically exact economy.
Mathematically perfected economy, Jim.
Okay, thank you. Mathematically perfected economy.
Right.
And Mike,
which
for
name,
those
of
who
course,
might have
comes as a consequence of mathematically resolving the issues which are presented by any prospective monetary thesis.
Okay. And for those who may have just joined us, Mike was just explaining that under the current system, which I guess has been in place since the Rothschilds started the Bank of England 4 centuries ago, and any central bank related to that type of system, all money issued to the population is in the form of debt, where we got to pay interest, and therefore it's impossible eventually and pretty quickly, and then that means there's inflation. And he was explaining other concepts around that. So go ahead, Mike.
Well, I'd correct you on a couple of points there. See, what this amounts to is I've done 40 years of research. In fact, over a few minutes in a high school classroom, which concurs that there is, in fact, one solution, and this is the first time that the actual math of the whole thing is brought to light and resolved. And what I've explained so far is that in response to a high school teacher's assertion that circulatory inflation causes price inflation, which is a familiar concept of the Austrian economists who were mentioned earlier, and Ron Paul regularly claims that there's circulatory inflation because of how much money is being poured into circulation. But see, that's not the math. The math is that the circulation is a consequence of how much interest and principal we're paying out of circulation versus how much principal is being reintroduced or reflated beyond this deflation, which relates to this quote of Thomas Jefferson. But let's pick up the thought where I left off, because I'm in a high school class. I'm a very advanced mathematics student who's in college algebra classes in the 2nd grade. Now I'm in high school, and a teacher has just said he's given the definitions of inflation and deflation as increases or decreases in circulation per goods and services. And I've just proven, in effect, this is a literal mathematic proof, that it's mathematically impossible, if you merely collateralize debts, to suffer circulatory inflation. Therefore, circulatory inflation absolutely positively cannot be the cause of price inflation. But I'm about to prove the cause of price inflation in the next part, or the next part of my rhetorical question. So I've said, first of all, as the debts are collateralized, how is it even possible to suffer a circulatory inflation? And the teacher is affirmed. He says, by God, I think you're right. Then I say, well, furthermore, being as the debts come into circulation as debts subject to interest, therefore this would comprise an implicit obligation to reborrow what principal and interest we're paying out of the circulation to maintain what I call a vital circulation. That is, a circulation which suffices to sustain the industry which is obligated to service this sum of debt. So this, I'm explaining to my high school teacher that therefore what principal we are obligated to pay out of circulation and reborrow back into circulation as a new debt equal to the former sum of debt, which otherwise might be presumed to be resolved, therefore makes it mathematically impossible to pay down the sum of debt. In other words, people, what you need to understand from just this much is that this obfuscation of the currency makes it mathematically impossible to pay down the sum of any prior sum of debt merely in maintaining a vital circulation. For what principal we have to reborrow to maintain a vital circulation. But on the further hand, what interest we're paying out of circulation, being as it counted none against any former sum of debt, and as it is reborrowing it back into circulation, therefore introduces new debt. Therefore, the sum of debt inherently and irreversibly increases by so much as periodic interest on an ever greater sum of debt until then, at an inherently escalating rate, we would even suffer inevitable terminal failure. That is, a sum of debt which is both too great